going to have Matthew Kolisnyk come up and give some really interesting research advances here. He's a PhD candidate in neurosciences at Western, and he's, among other things, our second Rising Star Awardee from our trainees within the CDTRP. So we're super excited to have him here. So thank you, Matthew.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And of course, thank you for the organizers for inviting me here today. It really is a privilege to talk about this, and with such beautiful introductions, I feel like I'm ready to just jump right in and tell you a little bit about the science. So we're all here today because we want to understand death a little bit better. And what we know is that death is a very complicated process, and it is defined by the 2023 guidelines as the irreversible loss of brain function. But clinicians have the difficult job of actually deciding when death determination occurs within that complicated process. And this is even more complicated in the context of organ donation, where there's a tension between determining the moment of death that is both, one, first and foremost, ensuring that the donor has no capacity for consciousness and suffering, and of course, also preserving the organ's viability for transplantation. So the principles that underlie death determination within this context are based on the fundamental relationship between essentially the heart and the brain. Well, the heart sends its blood up to the brain uses that to support the vast majority of activity that we associate with regular everyday functioning. In the context of withdrawal, which occurs in the case of organ donation, we see that these different processes begin to wane, and they wane in a not necessarily in even order, but we see that circulation eventually decreases, brain blood flow eventually decreases, and as does brain activity. And then the principles that underlie circulatory death essentially say that we pick a point where we believe that at this point, circulation can no longer support meaningful brain function. We wait an additional 5 minutes, as Sunny mentioned, and we refer to this point as circulatory death, right? And only at that point would you even begin doing the organ retrieval process. So what you might have noticed is that circulatory death, while based on these foundational medical principles, relies on the assumption that once systemic circulation falls below this set threshold, this 5 millimeters mercury, brain blood flow can no longer support meaningful brain activity, and hence you meet this definition of irreversible loss of brain function, right? But this has not been empirically validated, especially the relationship between these three separate variables: systemic circulation, blood flow, and brain activity, in patients following withdrawal of life-sustaining measures. And that's what we're doing with this study. So we'll be measuring these in 7 different patients. And we're particularly interested in the temporal relationship between these processes, because in the event that you find this loss of systemic circulation, so at 5 millimeters mercury, what's happening with both brain blood flow and what's happening with both brain activity at those time points? Is there any evidence at all of any type of potential brain function, and again, the potential for awareness or suffering? And we also want to see how different types of systemic parameters, including pulse pressure and mean arterial pressure, change when these processes are lost. So this was a single center prospective observational trial. It's part of the DPART study. Now we're looking at the neural measures within the DPART study. And it included adult patients undergoing withdrawal of life-sustaining therapies in accordance with best care practices. And so we didn't do anything other than we followed the guidelines for regular withdrawal. We put this neural equipment on the patient's head, just like this. So 2 different types of neural measures. So we have brain blood flow, which is measured with TCD, and then electroencephalography, which measures our brain activity measures. So we placed these 2 different things on the patient's head, and then we left the room to allow for the regular withdrawal process. So it's an uncontrolled experiment, but it's a very difficult patient group to even do any type of research on. So any way in which we can get this type of information, we were going to go about doing that. And we defined the loss of brain blood flow, brain activity, and systemic circulation. So people were also equipped with a arterial cannula. And we basically wanted to find these moments of death across both loss of brain blood flow, loss of brain activity, and loss of systemic circulation. And that happened with identifying 3 different types of waveforms. So in the TCD signal, we are looking for either short systolic spikes or biphasic oscillatory flow. In the EEG signal, we're looking to see whether or not EEG falls below this 2 microvolt ratio. And then in our arterial measure, we're looking at this 5 millimeters mercury ratio. It's not important that you remember all these different things, but these are what the the guidelines or like the brain deaf studies tend to point towards when we say like there's no longer meaningful activity happening within this area. And what we're looking for is for each of these different patients, we're going to define 3 different things. So we have our loss of blood flow, we have our loss of brain activity, and we have our loss of systemic circulation. And we're going to look at that within each of our waveforms. So our loss of brain blood flow is right here, our loss of systemic circulation is here, and then our brain activity measure is here. And so we're marking those different points across our time series, and we're looking at the temporal association across those 3 different events. Because EEG was only collected in a subset of patients, we'll be focusing more so on the TCD results, but I do have a couple of slides to show you those EEG results because they are interesting and should spark some interesting discussion. So here's our patient demographics. So we had 7 patients in total, a wide range of emitting diagnoses and ages. And as I said before, so 7 of the patients had brain blood flow measures, and only 3 of these 7 patients had EEG measures, and all patients had a measure of systemic circulation. So it's a busy plot, but let me walk you through it. So at time 0, we have when the loss of systemic circulation occurred, okay? And in blue, we're looking at, blue would be this case in which loss of brain blood flow occurred before the loss of systemic circulation, okay? And then red would be the opposite. And what we're noticing that in 6 out of 7 patients, loss of brain blood flow occurred before the loss of systemic circulation. And in 1 patient, we actually had a simultaneous loss of systemic circulation and brain blood flow. This patient sustained a cardiac arrest during the withdrawal process. I think most importantly, we're seeing that all the times are way before the times in which we would declare circulatory death, and that's the time in which you would start to do organ retrieval. So it's hard to imagine meaningful brain activity occurring when there's a loss of brain blood flow. So again, this supports these current protocols for organ donation. So it's a very supportive result. Similarly, if you look at different systemic parameters, such as pulse pressure and mean arterial pressure, it supports the same type of idea. When there is a loss of brain blood flow, you're seeing that this occurred at higher pulse pressure and mean arterial pressure as compared to when there's a loss of systemic circulation. And again, we can discuss the implications of that as a potential marker for like loss of brain activity or loss of brain function, but that's a discussion for later. So we can look at the results now looking at the association between brain blood flow and brain activity. And so again, this is a small sample size, but this is the data that we've got. So again, time 0 indicates the loss of brain activity in this case. So in this case, we see that loss of brain blood flow occurred before the loss of brain activity. That tends to make sense. We did have 1 case in which the loss of brain blood flow occurred after the loss of brain activity. It's not concerning, it's just an interesting case study where you see that when the loss of brain activity was occurred, so you're seeing at the EEG signal, it's within this 2 microvolt range. So this is when we say like there's no longer meaningful brain activity occurring. You're still seeing that there's meaningful arterial, and then there's also meaningful TCD data as well. Although you're seeing shortly thereafter, you're starting to see the decrease in both of these measures. And if you actually look, this was the patient that actually had a simultaneous cardiac arrest, a sudden cardiac arrest during the withdrawal process. So you're seeing shortly thereafter, they've lost both of these things, and you're still seeing the EEG is relatively the same between these 2 different points. So again, this sort of just looks at, it's an interesting case study to see how these 2 different processes are interacting with each other. But again, nothing to discourage organ donation protocols or anything like that. When we look at this case now between this loss of systemic circulation and also brain activity, we're seeing in blue is a situation where loss of brain activity occurred before the loss of systemic circulation. And then red, we're seeing where loss of brain activity occurred after loss of systemic circulation. So this would be the slightly more worrying case, but again, it still is lost before our circulatory death measures are occurred. 1 caveat with this patient is that there's just quite a lot of noise within the EEG signal, and which is another potential topic for discussion. There's, to my eye, as somebody who's looked at a lot of EEGs, there's nothing necessarily meaningful ongoing within the EEG signals. There's just quite a bit more noise within the signal, and that just makes you go incrementally above that very conservative threshold, that 2 microvolt threshold, and that's what's causing you to, I guess, become close to this time point. But for me, it's not meaningful brain activity either way, so I don't think it bothers. But in any case, it doesn't bypass this circulatory death threshold. So generally, when we're looking across our patients, we tend to see this pattern. we have a loss of brain blood flow, which is followed by the loss of brain activity. It's just followed by the loss of systemic circulation. So if we look at one example patient, we're seeing that when the loss of brain blood flow occurred, we're seeing these sharp systolic spikes. That's a sign of brain death according to other studies. You're still seeing a small, but above our threshold arterial blood pressure and some type of EEG signal that's above our threshold. When we now look at the loss of brain activity, we're seeing that now EEG signal is centered basically around 0. It's not deviating past our 2 microvolt range, other than this cardiac artifact, but it's just an artifact. And you're still seeing some type of arterial pressure above our 5 millimeters mercury threshold. And then finally, when we look at our loss of systemic circulation, you're seeing loss of brain blood flow, you're seeing arterial pressure below that 5 millimeter mercury range, and you're seeing EEG that looks essentially like noise. So again, if we were to extrapolate it all from the study, this would be one of the sequence of events that occur as patients are withdrawn. So that's what we have in conclusion. We provided some empirical evidence about the physiological sequence that occurred during death. And we tend to define this type of sequence: loss of brain blood flow, followed by loss of brain activity, followed by loss of systemic circulation. And I think this has a lot of implications for the understanding of biology of death, organ donation protocols, and novel transplantation methods. So a slight plug for our other studies. So new part will be, again, this is only 7 patients. Now we're extending it now to multi-center Canadian institutions, 6 different Canadian institutions, 90 patients in total, collecting all the same type of data to see if we can still find the same conclusions that we did from this study. And our conclude study involves now applying this same type of methodology to cases of NRP. So we're really hoping to be able to address these fundamental questions within transplantation. That's maybe a topic for later. And I think most importantly, I think the results help reassure families and healthcare providers that patients are beyond experiencing suffering at the point of organ recovery. And with that, I'd like to thank particularly the patients and their family who participated in this study. And of course, thank you all for your attention.